In the quiet northern hills of California, the tiny village of Eldon Hollow had carried a heavy silence for nearly 3 decades, a silence born from a mystery too painful to speak aloud. In 1984, devoted nuns vanished without leaving a single clue behind. No cries for help, no signs of struggle, just an aching void that swallowed them whole, leaving behind only whispered theories and hollow prayers. Now, 28 years later, a shocking revelation was about to surface, one that would shake the foundations of faith and community alike. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Agnes of Mercy Catholic Church, splashing warm hues of ruby, sapphire, and emerald across the pews. At the altar stood Father Elias Morrow, his voice a calm anchor in the sea of remembrance. "May the souls of the departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace," he intoned, making the sign of the cross. A quiet amen echoed back from the gathered congregation, men and women of all ages, their faces heavy with the weight of memory and sorrow. As the memorial service concluded, Father Elias moved slowly toward the arched entryway of the church, greeting each parishioner with gentle words and a comforting clasp of the hand. Mo spoke in hushed tones, reverent, almost rehearsed, as if repeating lines in a long-standing play of grief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harmon," he said, taking the hands of a frail, silver-haired woman. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I always come, Father," she replied, her voice trembling. "I still remember Sister Mildred teaching my children their catechism. She was such a gentle soul." He nodded, the ache in his chest returning like an old, familiar wound. Sister Mildred Hayes had been 68 when she vanished, leaving behind decades of selfless devotion and unanswered questions. Alongside her was Sister Joan Keller, 65, Sister Beatrice Namora, just 28, and the youngest of them all, Sister Ters Morrow, only 23. For Father Elias, the tragedy cut deeper than mere sorrow. Sister Ters wasn't just a spiritual companion, she was his biological sister, and her loss had shattered the very pillars of his faith. After the last of the mourners had departed, leaving behind only the creaking of wooden pews and the rustling of distant wind through cemetery trees, Father Elias walked the length of the empty church. Each footstep echoed like a heartbeat in a hollow chamber. He made his way to a small, humble office tucked away behind the sanctuary. The room was unassuming, just a desk, a window overlooking the gravestones, and books on scripture and theology. But it was here that his private anguish dwelt. Lowering himself into the creaking chair, he placed his face in his hands. The confident priest the community saw was gone. In his place was a man still haunted by the shadows of the past. "Why, Lord," he whispered, his voice raw, unraveling at the seams, "I have served you every day of my life. Ters gave herself to you fully. Why haven't you shown me the truth? What lesson am I still blind to?" Tears streaked silently down his cheeks, his body trembling with grief he rarely let surface. Only on this day, this anniversary, did he allow himself to crumble, the way a heart breaks under the pressure of too many years holding it all in. At last, he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small wooden box. Within it, memories slept frozen in time. He lifted a photo from the box, its edges worn but the image still vivid. It was Ters on the day she took her final vows, radiant with hope, eyes sparkling with the unwavering certainty of her path. She had been just 16 when she first confided in him, her voice filled with passion and unwavering devotion. "I want to serve him," she had said, and he had encouraged her, believed in her calling. "I was so proud of you," he whispered to the photo. "I still am." But no matter how many times he repeated the words, a cruel thought always crept into his heart, one he tried to bury each time it returned. If I hadn't pushed her toward this life, would she still be alive today? Would she be married, teaching, laughing somewhere far from here? He caught himself, his hand rising instinctively. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," he said firmly, crossing himself as if to exorcise the doubt. There was no room in his soul for questioning God's plan, not again. Not when the darkness still lingered, waiting for the light of truth to finally break through. Setting aside the photo of his sister, Father Elias reached for another image, one that never failed to stir a storm of emotion. It was the last known photograph of the 4 missing nuns, taken just days before their disappearance. They sat together on a weathered wooden bench outside the modest St. Dina's Chapel, nestled near the edge of the Shasta Trinity National Forrest, Sister Mildred and Sister Joan, the oldest of the group, wore peaceful expressions, their hands resting gently in their laps. Sister Beatrice appeared slightly more relaxed, though still composed in her reverence. And then there was Ters, the youngest of the four, her eyes shining with fierce devotion even through the fading print. It was a picture that spoke volumes, though it held none of the answers. The image had been taken by a local traveler, who'd stopped by the chapel during a hike through the nearby trails. The nuns had been sent there on a 2-day spiritual retreat, a time of fasting, prayer, and reflection in preparation for the feast of a Catholic saint. But their mission hadn't been purely devotional. The diocese had asked them to inspect St. Dina's, an aging structure built in the 1920s, and determine whether it was worth restoring or should be retired from service. With her keen eye and meticulous nature, Sister Ters had been assigned to document the building's condition. Father Elias had often wondered what she might have seen, what detail might have caught her attention, or whether something she noticed had triggered events no one could have predicted. He stared at the photograph, calculating in silence as he'd done so many times before. Sister Mildred would be 96 now, Sister Joan, 93. Even if some miracle had spared them, age would have taken its toll. But Beatrice'd only be 56, Ters, just 51, still young enough, still strong enough, if they had survived. The thought was both hope and torture. He remembered those frantic days after they disappeared, how the police combed every inch of the forest, sent helicopters over ridgelines, dispatched teams through farms and logging towns. Not a single piece of clothing, no personal items, no signs of panic. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Eventually, the official explanation settled into something that satisfied paperwork, but not hearts: a bear attack. The Shasta Trinity National Forest was home to black bears, agile, fast, and potentially aggressive. Maybe the women had wandered off the path and startled one. But to Father Elias, the theory had always felt hollow. No blood, no torn garments, no remains, no struggle, just nothing. Even the most seasoned investigators had admitted how strange it was. Over time, darker rumors took root, that the nuns had broken their vows, that they had grown weary of quiet lives and slipped away to start over, somewhere far from the constraints of their calling. The church had worked hard to stamp out such stories, but doubt spreads like wildfire in a small town. Some whispered it in grocery aisles, others in hushed tones at kitchen tables. But Father Elias had never once entertained it. She would never have done that, he murmured, his fingers gently tracing the image of his sister's face. Ters would never have left without telling me. As his eyes drifted beyond the figures in the photo, he focused on the chapel. Standing in the background, its whitewashed walls, the slanted roof, the small bell tower barely peeking above the tree line. St. Dina's had once been a beacon for scattered Catholic families in the region, a humble place for worshippers too far from the city to attend larger services. But it had long since been abandoned, overtaken by time and forest. Father Elias hadn't set foot near it in over 20 years. The pain was simply too great. But now, on this anniversary, something shifted. As he studied the photo, he felt a strange, almost magnetic pull and urge to return. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was his aching heart looking for a connection to his sister. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more. A whisper in the back of his mind suggested there was still something out there, something the search teams had missed. After all these years, it sounded ridiculous, and yet, the feeling wouldn't let go. Father Elias slowly placed the photographs back in their box except for the one of the 4 women at the chapel, which he slipped into his pocket. He stood, retrieved his Bible and rosary, and left the office with a determination he hadn't felt in years. As he stepped into the late morning sun and made his way across the parking lot, a sense of calm resolve settled over him. Sliding into the driver's seat of his modest sedan, he laid the photograph on the passenger seat and whispered a brief prayer for clarity and protection. Then he started the engine, turned onto the winding road, and headed toward the Forrester ward, the chapel, the truth, and the ghosts that had followed him for nearly 3 decades. The winding road out of Eldon Hollow led Father Elias through a gradual unraveling of civilization. The neat rows of houses and small-town storefronts gave way to the open sprawl of farmland, and before long, even those signs of humanity disappeared. Towering pines and ancient cedars flanked the roadside. their branches weaving sunlight and shadow across the asphalt like a slow-moving patchwork quilt. It was a drive he hadn't taken in decades, yet the path felt familiar, almost sacred. It took about 90 minutes to reach the edge of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, time enough for reflection, for memories that had long since burned themselves into his soul. He remembered the early days after the nuns vanished, how his car had once been crammed with missing person flyers bearing Terzi's youthful smile, how his heart had been ablaze with frantic hope and stubborn belief that they would be found. Now, the seats beside him held only silence and the creased photograph of the 4 women. Hope had long since given way to a quieter companion, unresolved grief. As the road narrowed into the foothills, Father Elias eased off the gas. He knew the chapel had once stood near a small clearing, tucked away just beyond a dirt road that branched off from the highway. But when he reached what should have been the familiar turnoff, he blinked in confusion. Instead of the rutted trail he expected, there was a sleek, paved road blocked by an ornate wrought iron gate. No trespassing signs were posted in bold red letters, accompanied by additional warnings and legal notices that left no room for misunderstanding. "This can't be right," he murmured, pulling his car to the shoulder. He retrieved the photograph from the passenger seat and stepped out into the warm breeze, holding the picture up to compare it with the landscape before him. The ridgeline of trees and the distant mountain peaks aligned perfectly. This was the place, but St. Dina's chapel, once a humble beacon of prayer, was nowhere to be seen. Beyond the gate, the private road wound deeper into the forest, now carefully manicured with ornamental trees and neatly arranged shrubbery. It was no longer wilderness, it had become a private estate, a place stripped of its sacred past. Baffled, Father Elias pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in years: Harold Gibbons, the old caretaker of the chapel. With a deep breath, he dialed. After several rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Hello, Harold. This is Father Elias Morrow from St. Agnes in Eldon Hollow." There was a pause, then warm recognition. "Father Elias, well, it's been a while. How are you?" "I'm managing," he replied, though the words felt hollow. "I'm standing at what I believe used to be the entrance to St. Dina's, but the chapel is gone." A longer pause followed, then Harold's voice returned, slower now. "That's right, Father. The diocese decommissioned it back in '82. Attendance never recovered after the nuns disappeared. Then the bell tower cracked, almost crushed a local boy named Thomas Frell. The bishop decided it wasn't worth the repairs. They sold the land." "Sold it?" Father Elias said, stunned. "To whom?" "A man named Silas Redwood bought the property not long after the sale was finalized, tore the chapel down, built himself a private estate right where the old church used to be." A chill ran through Father Elias, despite the sun warming the back of his neck. "I was never told... Not about the sale or the demolition. It all happened quietly," Harold said, his voice sympathetic. "You were grieving. The bishop figured it was best not to stir up more pain." Father Elias stared at the gate, its black iron a stark contrast to the forest behind it. "Does Mr. Redwood still live there?" "Oh yes," Harold confirmed. "Keeps to himself. Bit of a recluse. Doesn't mingle with the locals, and folks say he's not exactly warm to visitors." "I was hoping to visit the chapel site," Father Elias said softly. "Today is... It's the anniversary." There was a long beat of silence before Harold replied, his tone softening. 28 years today. I'm sorry, Father. I really am. You came all this way, and the place isn't even here anymore. Do you think Mr. Redwood would allow me to enter the property if I explained why?" "I wouldn't count on it," Harold said cautiously. "He guards his privacy. Always has." Disappointment settled over Father Elias like a heavy cloak. His chest ached with the weight of another unanswered question. Another door closed. "But listen," Harold added, his tone shifting with a faint glimmer of optimism. "I still live close by, no more than 15 minutes from where you are. I saved a few things from the chapel before it was torn down. The altar cross, some of the old prayer books, even a chalice. If you'd like, you're welcome to stop by and see them." For the first time that day, a flicker of warmth returned to Father Elias's face. "Thank you, Harold," he said quietly. "I would like that very much." "That's very kind of you," Father Elias said, offering a grateful nod to Harold. "Perhaps I will stop by. But first, I feel compelled to speak with Mr. Redwood directly. Do you happen to know how I might reach his residence?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, you're looking at the private road now, but that gate's always locked," Harold said, hesitating. "There's a public road that loops around to the other side of the property. It'll get you close enough, though not all the way." After jotting down Harold's directions, Father Elias offered a sincere thank you and ended the call. Standing by his car, he hesitated, torn between respect for a man's privacy and the quiet, insistent pull in his heart that told him he had to go. Logic said he should turn around and head to Harold's home. But something deeper urged him forwards, something unspoken, like a voice from a time long past. Roughly 20 minutes later, Father Elias was guiding his sedan down a narrow, tree-lined lane that circled the outskirts of what was unmistakably Redwood's estate. Through breaks in the foliage, he glimpsed stretches of groomed landscape, pristine hedgerows, and eventually, the house itself a sprawling structure of natural stone and dark timber, rising 3 stories high. It looked more like a luxurious mountain lodge than a private residence, with wide terraces and large windows gazing out over the encroaching forest. The contrast between its opulence and the humble, weathered chapel that once stood nearby struck Father Elias with an odd unease. He spotted a small gravel lot near what appeared to be a side entrance and pulled in. After straightening his clerical collar, he climbed out of the car, pocketing the worn photograph once more. A stone path led him through immaculate gardens and around a tranquil decorative pond. The place was beautiful, meticulously built by. Beneath its craftsmanship, Father Elias couldn't shake the sense of something dissonant, almost too perfect. When he reached the large oak front door, he lifted a hand and knocked firmly. To his surprise, it opened almost instantly. Standing before him was a tall man in his 60s with a lean, athletic build, dressed in upscale workout clothes and holding a leather dog leash. He had the cool, sculpted air of someone used to being in control. His salt and pepper hair was cut with precision, and his face, though striking, immediately twisted into visible irritation at the sight of the priest's collar. "Yes?" he asked curtly, his tone clipped and unmistakably impatient. "Good afternoon," Father Elias said with a calm, warm smile. "Are you Mr. Silas Redwood?" The man's jaw tensed. "I am. And you are trespassing." "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," Elias replied, extending his hand in peace. "My name is Father Elias Morrow, from St. Agnes of Mercy Church, in Eldon Hollow." Redwood ignored the gesture. "What do you want?" he snapped, fingers tightening slightly around the leash. "I was hoping I could have a moment of your time," Elias said, keeping his voice steady. "I visited the site where St. Dina's Chapel once stood, and I was surprised to find it gone." "If you already saw it's not there," Redwood interrupted, "why come knocking on my door?" "I spoke with Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker," Elias explained. "He mentioned you had purchased the land, and I simply wanted to." "To what?" Redwood cut in sharply, stepping forward with an edge that was unmistakably confrontational. "Blame me for buying land that was legally for sale. That ground wasn't sacred to anyone but the sentimental." The diocese didn't seem to think it was worth saving. Father Elias instinctively stepped back, hands raised slightly. "No, I don't blame you at all. I'm only here because that chapel held personal meaning for me. I had no idea it had been torn down." Redwood's expression shifted Donnelly slightly. His features remained cold, but the fury dulled to a simmer. "Well, now you know," he said. "It's gone, and good riddance. I sleep better at night without that miserable bell clanging 3 times a day, rattling my windows and giving me migraines." Despite himself, Father Elias felt a flare of emotion. "The Angelus bell," he said softly, "is a centuries-old tradition. It calls the faithful to prayer and reflection. It's a symbol of grace, a reminder of sacred things in a noisy world." Redwood scoffed. "People can set phone alarms if they need reminders to pray. No one needs some medieval racket echoing across the hills." It was clear the conversation was deteriorating. Father Elias took a breath, changing his tone. "I understand that you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood. I've come uninvited, and for that, I sincerely apologize. Perhaps there might be another time, more convenient, when we could speak further if you're open to it." "There won't be another day," Redwood said coldly, each word like a slammed door. "I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed for decades with a priest I've never met. Now, I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Father Elias gave a slow nod, realizing there was nothing more to be gained from this confrontation. "Very well," he said gently. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. Peace be with you." The door closed firmly, abruptly ending the exchange with a finality that left the priest standing alone on the stone porch. He let out a heavy sigh and turned back toward his car, the tension in his shoulders settling into quiet disappointment. But beneath that disappointment was something more, an unsettling impression that Silas Redwood's hostility wasn't rooted merely in annoyance or territorial pride. There was something deeper in the man's demeanor, something defensive, almost afraid. As Father Elias reached his vehicle, he paused and glanced back toward the house. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure behind an upper window, curtained just the slightest shadow, too vague to confirm. Still, the sensation of being watched clung to him like mist in the forest, prickling his skin as he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. He sat there for a moment, conflicted. He could return to Eldon Hollow, or he could drive the short distance to Harold's home and find some comfort in the relics saved from St. Dina's Chapel. Perhaps that would offer the closure he'd hoped for today. But his hands moved almost automatically, steering the car back toward the winding road that curved near the former chapel grounds. He couldn't explain why it wasn't logic that guided him, but something else. A quiet pull, as if something unseen was reaching out to him as he rounded a familiar bend. The landscaped clearing where the chapel had once stood came into view through the trees. What had once been sacred ground now bore ornamental shrubs and decorative stonework. No trace of the humble white chapel remained. And then, suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life. A low, haunting sound filled the Caben Gregorian chant. That unmistakable ancient melody, otherworldly and reverent, filled the air as if rising from the very earth itself. Startled, Father Elias gripped the wheel, eyes darting to the dashboard. The radio was off. He remembered clearly turning it off before leaving Eldon Hollow, yet now it was alive with the voices of long-dead monks, echoing a prayerful song older than any building in Eldon Hollow. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, heart pounding, and stared at the radio in disbelief. The chant lingered for a few more seconds, then vanished as suddenly as it had begun. "What on earth?" he murmured, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the dial. He turned the radio on and off again. Silence, just the soft ticking of the engine cooling. Had he imagined it? Some strange auditory illusion, the byproduct of fatigue and grief, or a malfunction of the car's aging electronics. And yet, as he sat in the stillness, that same unmistakable feeling returned, the same one that had gripped him back in his office while holding the photograph. A stirring in his chest, a rising warmth behind his ears. The hairs on his arms stood upright. These were sensations he had come to recognize, not as emotion or coincidence, but as something deeper. In seminary, his spiritual director had called it the voice behind the silence, a potential whisper of the Holy Spirit. Then, as if to confirm it, the chant returned, faint yet undeniable, emerging once more from the dead radio. And this time, there was no doubt. He knew he wasn't imagining it, compelled by something larger than logic. Father Elias shifted into reverse and executed a careful U-turn. Whatever force had drawn him here wasn't finished. He drove slowly back toward the main gate that barred entry to Silas Redwood's estate. He parked at the edge of the road, just beyond the thick metal gate, and sat in silence, staring at the stern "No Trespassing" signs glaring back at him like sentinels. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he wrestled with the moral implications. Trespassing was not a trivial offense, especially for a man of the cloth. And yet, this wasn't mere curiosity anymore. Something beyond understanding was at work here, something sacred. "Lord, guide my actions," he whispered aloud. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right path." The strange warmth stirred again, that same pressure in his chest and behind his ears, the unmistakable sensation he had only ever felt during moments of profound spiritual clarity. With a deep breath, Father Elias stepped out of the vehicle. He approached the gate slowly, reverently, as though the very ground might speak. He was fully aware of what he was doing, what he was risking, but his every instinct told him that something lay beyond that gate, something the world had buried, but heaven had not forgotten. Something stirred deep within Father Eliezer, conviction that transcended logic, one that had nothing to do with rules or personal safety. It was not recklessness that moved him, but a spiritual certainty, as though he was being led. Rather than attempt to force the locked gate, he turned and began following the perimeter fence, scanning for a vantage point that might offer a clearer view of the chapel's former location. Fence itself was no simple barrier. 8 feet of ornate, heavy metal work followed the terrain's natural rise and fall, occasionally dipping where the forest floor rose unevenly. Father Elias closed his eyes for a moment, reaching into memory. He pictured the chapel as it had once stood, simple, whitewashed, wooden the way it looked in the photo. The bench where the nuns had been photographed was on the eastern side, beneath a great oak tree. When he opened his eyes, he searched the landscape for any surviving landmarks. The oak was gone, likely uprooted during the estate's construction, but a cluster of tall pine trees behind where the chapel had once stood remained intact. They offered a quiet reference point, standing like sentinels that had outlived both worship and memory. He continued along the fence, moving toward that invisible anchor in the past. But as he stepped over a tangle of undergrowth, his foot caught on a knotted tree root hidden beneath the leaves. He stumbled forward, reaching instinctively to catch himself, both hands gripping the cold iron fence. The force of his fall landed hard against the section where the metal posts had been anchored into uneven earth. A sharp crack rang out, followed by the groan of bending metal. The joint gave way, and to his astonishment, a section of the fence broke loose, just wide enough for a man to slip through. Sprawled half inside Redwood's estate, Father Elias froze. "Oh dear Lord," he breathed, brushing soil from his clothes as he stood. He hadn't meant to damage anything, least of all violate the boundary of a man who had already made his hostility clear. And yet, there it was, an open path. Whether it was providence or temptation, he didn't know, but it was real. He glanced back toward the road. The forest was silent, deserted. No passing cars, no hidden onlookers, just the whispering leaves and the weight of decision. He looked again at the gap in the fence, then at the clearing beyond it. Once holy ground. He made the sign of the cross. "Forgive me," he whispered, then carefully stepped through. On the other side, Father Elias moved quickly but cautiously. He kept close to the trees, scanning the ground for any remnants of the old chapel. But there was nothing. The place had been thoroughly, and it seemed, intentionally erased. Ornamental shrubs from foreign climates lined the garden beds. Decorative stones and manicured walkways gave the land a curated, sterile feel. There was no cross, no plaque, no altar, no sign that prayers had ever been whispered here. It struck him deeply, not just the absence of the building, but the deliberate erasure of its existence. It was as if Redwood hadn't simply built over the chapel. He'd tried to wipe it from memory altogether. Father Elias stood still, letting the quiet settle, until a glint of light caught his eye. Near the edge of a hedge, something metallic flashed briefly. Curious, he stepped closer, parting the low shrubbery to reveal a rusted iron grate set into the ground. A vent. It looked old, the kind of ventilation system one might find in basements, built nearly a century ago. Its metalwork was ornate, with delicate scroll patterns along the outer framer design that stood in stark contrast to the clean, modern lines of the estate above it. Why would such a feature remain if the chapel had been fully demolished? More importantly, what need was there for air circulation in a garden with no building overhead? Kneeling beside the grate, Father Elias peered through the rusted bars. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, the unmistakable sound of humming drifted upward. It was not a recording. It was live, human, soft, melodic, and eerily familiar. His breath caught. Gregorian chant. It was the same melody he had heard earlier. Only now, it was no fluke of the radio. This was real. He leaned closer, listening, and then came something even more chilling. A cough, human, tired, weak. Father Elias's blood ran cold. "Hello," he called softly, voice trembling. The humming continued, undisturbed, as if the person below couldn't hear him. He stood, heart racing. Someone was beneath this ground, beneath the very site where St. Dina's once stood. Who, why, and for how long? He scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting Silas Redwood to appear, rage in his eyes. But the estate remained eerily still. The thick stand of pines blocked any view of the main house, and no security cameras were visible nearby. For the first time since stepping onto the property, Father Elias wasn't afraid. He was certain that this wasn't coincidence, and that he had been brought here for a reason. Something or someone was waiting beneath this soil, and their story was not finished yet, was impossible to ignore. The coincidence was too precise, too deliberate. Father Elias sat motionless in the driver's seat, the rosary beads slipping rhythmically through his fingers as he whispered prayers, each word rising like incense toward a heaven that, at the moment, felt hauntingly silent. But deep within, he sensed something stirring, truth not buried but waiting, ready to be unearthed. After nearly 3 decades of darkness, he had made the right decision. Calling the authorities had been the only responsible course of action. And yet, even as he replayed his conversation with the 911 dispatcher in his mind, he couldn't shake the dread clinging to his every thought. His report had sounded bizarre, even to himself. A trespassing priest, claiming to hear Gregorian chanting and coughing beneath a vent on private property. But it was real. He knew what he'd heard. And now, that strange the cessation of the singing, felt even more ominous than the chant itself. The dispatcher had assured him officers were en route, and Elias had promised to wait by the roadside gate. Yet part of him longed to return to the grate, to press his ear to the earth, and listen again to prove to himself that he hadn't imagined it. That someone, somewhere, was indeed down there, breathing the stale air of an unseen chamber. Someone who might still be alive. The sharp trill of his ringtone broke the silence, and Elias quickly answered. "Harold, Father," came the familiar, steady voice. "I'm on my way, should be pulling up in a few minutes." "Good," Elias replied, lowering his voice instinctively. Harold, when St. Dina's was still standing, was there. Any chance there could have been a basement, or a crypt, anything underground at all? The hesitation on the other end told him everything. "No, Father," Harold finally said. "There was never anything like that. I helped maintain that chapel for over 20 years. It was built flat, simple, no cellar, no hidden storage, just a slab foundation, nothing more." Elias's throat tightened. "Then that vent, whatever's beneath it, it must have been constructed after the chapel was torn down." A pause. "You think Redwood built it?" "I don't know," Elias replied honestly. "But if someone's trapped down there, we can't rule anything out." "That's deeply disturbing," Harold said, his voice now tinged with urgency. "I'm almost there. I'll help you talk to the police." "Thank you," Elias said quietly, before ending the call. He looked out across the treetops and the elegant landscape that now covered what had once been holy ground. Redwood had demolished the chapel, but what had he built in its place, and why had he built it underground? The humming had stopped, but faint shuffling sounds beneath the earth had not. The memory of it, raw and real, replayed in his mind, louder than any wind rustling through the forest. As he sat, waiting for flashing lights to crest the hill, Father Elias pressed the crucifix of his rosary between his fingers and prayed not just for clarity, but for deliverance. Because if someone was down there after all this time, then the mystery that had haunted Eldon Hollow for 28 years was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to break the surface. "It doesn't sound good." His voice was low, firm, edged with urgency. Father Elias felt his pulse quicken. The confirmation hearing another human being acknowledge what he had feared and hoped made the situation feel suddenly real, tangible, not the product of a weary mind or divine whisper, but something raw, immediate, and deeply human. Someone was trapped, and they were suffering. Deputy Williams stood slowly, turning to his partner. "We need backup and medical on standby," he said, already reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "Also get a search and rescue unit with structural access gear. If there's an underground chamber, we'll need to get to it safely." As Reynolds began radioing in their findings, Williams turned back to Father Elias. "You said you were here on the anniversary of the disappearance of 4 women, correct? The nuns?" "Yes," Father Elias replied, his voice taut with emotion. 28 years ago today, they vanished without a trace after retreating to this very site. My sister, Terry's, was one of them." Williams raised an eyebrow, not with skepticism, but concern. "You believe there's a connection?" "I don't know what I believe," Elias admitted, "but the timing, the location, the singing, it's not just coincidence. That was a sacred chant we all heard Salve Regina. It was part of our evening prayers when I was in seminary. It's not something you just hum absent-mindedly." Harold nodded beside him. "And no one outside the faith would hum it that way. Not with that tone, that reverence." Williams looked between them, then down at the rusted grate again, his jaw set. "Whoever is down there, however long they've been there, needs help now. We're going in as soon as backup arrives." Reynolds finished his radio call and returned. ETA for rescue is under 20 minutes. Medics are mobilizing. The four men stood in silence, the weight of their discovery settling heavily in the forest air around them. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Father Elias found himself staring at the vent once more. That voice, weak, distant, but unmistakably human, had reached out through decades of silence. It had crossed the boundary between the forgotten and the found. And in that moment, beneath the earth where a chapel once stood, faith and truth finally began to rise. Deputy Williams raised a calming hand, his voice firm but measured. "Mr. Redwood, this is no longer about personal grievances or past property sales. We have credible evidence that someone may be in distress beneath your land. Now, you can either cooperate, or we'll request a warrant to conduct a full search." Redwood's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck tightening as the German shepherd at his side gave a low, uneasy growl. His eyes flicked between the officers, then to Father Elias, and finally to the wooded edge of his estate. "You people are unbelievable," he snapped. "Fine, if it'll get you off my property, I'll walk you to the area myself. But I'm telling you right now, you're going to feel awfully foolish when you find nothing but dirt and rock." "Thank you for your cooperation," Deputy Reynolds said, with an air of finality that suggested he wasn't buying Redwood's feigned compliance. "Lead the way." As Redwood turned abruptly, tugging the dog along, the deputies followed, with Harold and Father Elias staying behind at the edge of the drive. Harold glanced at the priest, lowering his voice. "Did you see his face when they mentioned the vent?" Father Elias nodded solemnly. He flinched. "He knows more than he's admitting. I've seen him around town over the years," Harold muttered. "Always private. But this is something else." The minutes that followed were tense, quiet, and heavy with unspoken possibility. The forest, normally so full of life, seemed to pause around them as if waiting. Father Elias felt the rosary beads still in his pocket and clutched them tightly, whispering another prayer under his breath. Beyond the trees, the officers disappeared with Redwood down a path that led back toward the landscaped clearing. Whatever secrets had lain buried for 28 years were now trembling on the edge of discovery, and Father Elias, heart pounding in his chest, knew they were finally closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Father Elias took another slow sip of tea, the warmth of the mug doing little to ease the chill settling deeper into his bones. "That strikes me as odd," he murmured. "Why would someone buy sacred land, demolish the chapel so quickly, and then do nothing with it?" Harold shrugged, though unease flickered in his eyes. "Redwood always said he wanted privacy, solitude, claimed the forest gave him peace. But you're right, most people would at least build a guest house or studio. All he ever did was plant trees and flowers too carefully arranged, if you ask me, like he was hiding something in plain sight, like an entrance," Father Elias said softly, "to whatever lies beneath." Silence stretched between them, both men contemplating the implications. Then Harold stood abruptly. "Let me show you what I saved from the chapel. Might not mean much now, but maybe something in there will help you make sense of all this." He led Father Elias to the spare room at the back of the cabin. In the corner sat an old cedar trunk with worn brass fittings. Harold knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were relics of the chapel's former life, carefully folded altar cloths, a small brass censer, a few water-damaged hymnals, and at the bottom, wrapped in linen, a carved wooden cross. Father Elias reached in reverently, unwrapping the cross. It was worn from decades of handling, the wood darkened by time, but the intricate carving of the crucifixion remained vivid. On its back, someone had etched a single word, "Ora." "Pray, Father Elias," whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Who carved this?" Harold shook his head. "No idea. I found it behind the altar when I was clearing out the sacristy. Thought it was worth preserving." Father Elias stared at the inscription. It didn't offer answers, but it echoed something he'd felt since the moment he'd heard that voice beneath the earth. A call, a warning, a prayer, and he knew, deep in his soul, that the chapel was never truly decommissioned. Not in the way they thought. Something had been left behind, buried, hidden, or imprisoned, and whatever it was still alive. Redwood barked as the officers approached. "I told you already it's where I store gardening equipment and seasonal decorations. There is nothing in there but rakes and fertilizer." Deputy Williams didn't respond. He motioned for Deputy Reynolds to remain with Redwood while he and another officer opened the shed door. The hinges creaked as the door swung wide, revealing shelves lined with dusty tools, gardening gloves, and stacked plastic bins. The flashlight beam cut across the room until it stopped on the far wall. "Looks like a false panel," Williams murmured. His camera captured the scene, a slightly misaligned section of the rear wall, with fresher wood and no dust compared to the surrounding boards. The officer with him stepped forward and gave the panel a push. It gave way. Behind it, a narrow concrete stairwell led down into darkness. The temperature dropped palpably, and the air grew damp and stale. "I thought you said there was nothing underground." Deputy Reynolds called back to Redwood, who had gone visibly pale. "That wasn't part of the original shed," Redwood stammered. I didn't put that there." But no one was listening anymore. Deputy Williams activated his flashlight and began descending the steps, camera feed trembling slightly with each cautious footstep. Father Elias and Harold, watching from the car, leaned forward in silent anticipation, their eyes fixed on the screen. The stairs ended in a narrow corridor, the walls made of rough stone and older concrete, water stains trickling down their surfaces. Pipes ran overhead, some corroded, some newer. The deeper they went, the more it felt like a forgotten part of the world, hidden beneath the very earth. "This is no basement," Williams muttered. "This is a bunker." A heavy door appeared at the end of the corridor, steel, reinforced, with a sliding bolt. It had no handle on the inside. A small, grated window about eye level revealed only darkness beyond. Williams knocked twice. Silence. Then, a faint shuffle, and a voice. "Please," the woman said, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Please, don't go." Father Elias felt the air rush from his lungs. It was her, the same voice, the same timbre he had heard through the vent. "We're with the sheriff's department," Williams said firmly, his voice echoing through the narrow hallway. "We're here to help." With effort, he slid the bolt open and pushed the door inward. The camera illuminated a small, windowless room, stone walls, a mattress on the floor, a simple table, and her. A woman sat huddled in the corner, thin, her face partially obscured by a veil of silver-streaked hair. She blinked against the light like someone unused to seeing brightness. Deputy Williams approached gently. "Ma'am, can you tell us your name?" She lifted her face, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Sister Beatrice." Father Elias gasped aloud. "Dear God," he breathed. "She's alive. We're going to get you medical attention right away. Can you tell me if there's anyone else down here with you?" Sister Teresa's eyes drifted toward a dark corner of the chamber, where the camera's light had not yet reached. Her voice was faint, nearly lost in the hush of the underground room. "Beatrice," she whispered, "but she's gone to God now. Many years ago." Deputy Reynolds stepped forward and slowly panned his light into the corner. The beam illuminated a grim sight. Human remains, a skeleton lying on a similar thin mattress, partially covered with a tattered blanket. A small wooden cross was placed near the hands, which were folded as if in eternal prayer. The chamber fell silent. Father Elias, still watching from Harold's truck, broke down in tears. His sister had not only survived, but endured unimaginable isolation, had not been alone. Another of the missing nuns had perished here, her life ending in darkness beneath the very ground that once held their sacred chapel. "We need medics now," Deputy Williams said into his radio, his voice taut. "We have one confirmed survivor and one deceased, suspected long-term confinement. Get a stretcher and trauma kit down here ASAP." As the camera lingered on the etched crucifix in the stone, Sister Terrace murmured something again. Williams leaned closer. "He told us the world had ended, that only faith could keep us safe down here." Father Elias's blood ran cold. Whatever horrors had taken place beneath the former chapel, they had been cloaked in the language of salvation, twisted into a prison of devotion. The truth was no longer buried, and the reckoning had begun. Father Elias nodded and allowed Harold to guide him toward the waiting area. The hallway felt endless, the sterile lights humming above, as if echoing the tension in his chest. He clutched his rosary tightly, the beads worn smooth from years of prayers he now knew had not gone unheard. They sat in silence. Time lost meaning as the minutes dragged on, punctuated only by the distant sounds of intercom announcements and rolling gurneys. Occasionally, Harold would glance at Elias, but neither man spoke. There was nothing left to say, only waiting. Finally, a doctor appeared, mid-40s, kind eyes behind thick glasses, and the posture of someone used to delivering difficult truths. He approached them with careful steps. "Father Morrow." Elias stood immediately. "Yes, how is she?" "She's stable for now," the doctor said. "Dehydrated, malnourished, signs of long-term confinement. We've started her on fluids, and we're running a full panel of tests. Her vitals are weak but responding. The fact that she was conscious when you found her is a miracle in itself." Elias's knees nearly gave out with relief. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She asked for you." Moments later, Father Elias stood at the threshold of an ICU room, heart-pounding. Sister Terrace lay beneath crisp white sheets, wires and monitors surrounding her like the scaffolding of survival. Her eyes opened slowly as he entered. "Elias," she whispered, her voice like dried leaves in the wind. He approached, knelt beside her bed, and gently took her hand. "I never stopped looking, not for a single day." Tears welled in her eyes. "I prayed you would find me, even when I didn't believe anymore. I prayed. You were never alone," he said, voice thick. "And you're safe now, I promise." Her lips formed the faintest of smiles. "Tell me, it's morning." Father Elias leaned closer. "It's not just morning terrors, it's resurrection." And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, a sliver of peace touched the soul of Sister Terrace Morrow. "He drugged them," Deputy Williams said grimly. "According to the journal, he laced the communion wine they brought for their private mass. They lost consciousness one by one. After that, he used a covered utility van to remove them under the cover of night. The area was remote, and no one expected anything suspicious. By the time the congregation noticed they hadn't returned, he had already sealed the entrance to the underground chamber." Father Elias covered his mouth, horrified. "He desecrated the Eucharist to commit his crime." "Yes," Williams confirmed. "He planned everything. Even made fake notes, supposedly from the nuns, indicating they had extended their retreat. It gave him several extra days before anyone raised the alarm." Harold's face was pale. "It was evil, absolute evil." Father Elias nodded slowly. "Evil born of pain. But that doesn't excuse it. He stole nearly 3 decades from innocent women. From my sister." Deputy Williams's voice softened. "The journal, the tunnel, the remains, Sister of it forms a compelling case. We're moving forward with multiple charges: unlawful imprisonment, homicide, abuse, desecration of religious property, and depending on Sister Tears's testimony, potentially more." Father Elias sat in silence for a long moment before replying, "Will she be safe now? From him, from everything?" "She will," Williams answered firmly. "He's not going anywhere. The DA is already preparing a no bail request, and with what we've found, no judge in this state would ever release him. Thank you, Deputy, for everything. You did the right thing. Father, you didn't turn away when the truth became uncomfortable. Because of that, we uncovered a truth hidden for nearly 30 years. And now, she has a chance to live again." As the call ended, Father Elias lowered the phone to his lap, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of it all. Justice, grief, relief, and the fragile miracle of survival. Harold handed him another cup of tea, now lukewarm. "They'll want to hear her story one day," he said softly. Father Elias nodded. "And when they do, they'll hear of her courage, not her captivity, her faith, not her suffering." Outside the hospital, the sun dipped behind the pines, and for the first time in 28 years, the darkness that had hung over St. Dina's began to lift. "A few more hours won't break me," he finished, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Dr. Chen gave a sympathetic nod. "I'll let the ICU staff know to prepare for you. You'll be able to see her son just for a moment, but I think it will mean a lot to both of you." As she left, Father Elias sank back into his chair, overcome. Harold remained silent beside him, offering quiet companionship. The sterile waiting room faded from Father Elias's awareness as his mind filled with memories of a younger sister, full of laughter and devotion, of prayers unanswered for so many years, of an empty chapel where only questions had remained. Now, finally, there were answers, awful answers, but also a fragile hope. Not long after, a nurse in protective gear returned to escort him to the ICU. "She's awake," the nurse said gently, still disoriented. "But when we mentioned your name, she became calm, like she knew you were near." Father Elias donned the protective gear slowly, reverently, his hands trembling. When he finally stepped into the dimly lit ICU room, he saw her sister Teres lying in the hospital bed, her face gaunt but unmistakably hers, her eyes opened, slowly adjusting to the filtered light. When she saw him, a faint smile broke across her face, fragile and miraculous. She tried to raise her hand but couldn't, so Father Elias stepped forward, knelt beside her, and took her hand gently in his gloved one. "I found you," he whispered, tears spilling down his cheeks. Her lips moved again, barely audible. "I never stopped praying." And in that sacred moment, the nightmare of the past 28 years gave way only slightly to grace.